The cubs didn't giggle. They clicked. They chirped. Some of them even vibrated in their chitinous shells like startled wind chimes. But they didn't laugh, until I made the mistake of showing them how. It all started with a sneeze. No joke. One loud, obnoxious, unfiltered sneeze in the middle of a perfectly sterile education chamber, and 32 alien cubs, hatchlings, larvae, fledglings, whatever the term was for their species, turned to stare at me with pupilless eyes and slight jaw slack. Silence hung so heavy I could hear the tiny scuttling of a nervous Zarnic worm slithering in the back row. Then I chuckled. Just a soft, embarrassed laugh. And one of the cubs, a puffy-eyed little fur ball from the vellum accord, mimicked me. Badly. It came out like a wheezing compressor caught in a bucket. The other cubs erupted in high-pitched mimicry, like malfunctioning droids crashing into each other. I doubled over laughing, not from joy, but because it was so ridiculously terrible and earnest that my ribs hurt. That's when the classroom's behavior monitor flashed red. And that's when everything started to spiral. My name's Lara Quinn. I was Earth's first volunteer for the Galactic Cultural Integration Corps, a fancy name for let's send a human to teach alien kids basic empathy and not get eaten in the process. I was posted on Xyraxis 4, a terraformed moon in the perimeter ring where 37 species lived in carefully regulated harmony. And by regulated, I mean sterilized, emotion-filtered, joy-moderated order. Joy wasn't banned. Not exactly. It was just unsafe. Contagious. Messy. Or so they claimed. I wasn't even supposed to sneeze. Emotive outbreaks lead to psychological variants, warned the orientation packet. Human expressions should be moderated to avoid excessive emotional resonance. Do not display unregulated facial movements. But I hadn't expected the cold damp air to tickle my nose at the exact moment the cubs were memorizing the Treaty of First Contact. One sneeze. One laugh. And suddenly I was the cause of what the head instructor, a solemn-faced Kornak drone, later classified as an unauthorized cultural emotional outburst. Translation: I made kids laugh. And now they were obsessed. I tried to downplay it. The next day, I brought in some old Earth visual games to recalibrate their learning focus, puzzles, stacking blocks, logic webs. But every few minutes, one of them would mimic my laugh and the others would erupt. I tried to change my tactics, even spoke in a monotone for an entire hour, but the Zarnic worm kept vibrating its back segments in a low hum that sounded suspiciously like a giggle. By day 3, they had invented their own version of tag. I didn't even teach them that. They called it chase click, and instead of tagging, they just erupted into chaotic laughter when they cornered someone. It was adorable. It was hilarious. It was forbidden. By the end of the first week, I was summoned to the Council of Pedagogical Oversight. We have observed unauthorized behavioral modification in your group, buzzed Eldenrizg, a spindly tribdeon with translucent skin and a face like a dehydrated starfish. Explain the frequency of the laughter events. I didn't intend to introduce it, I said. It was an accident. The sneeze. Sneezing is not on the list of approved introductory emotional frameworks. I understand. But the cubs responded positively. They're more engaged. Their recall scores have tripled, and cultural contamination has consequences. Their neural echoes are no longer synchronized to regulatory rhythm. I blinked. They're 6. Their minds are most vulnerable at this stage. If laughter becomes encoded into their early empathy circuits, they may develop chaotic expressivity. Civilization demands uniformity of thought, Educator Quinn. That word, chaotic, echoed in my ears like a gavel. For humans, it was the spice of life. For them, it was a curse. I was given a formal warning and a new behavioral tracking visor. It scanned for unauthorized emotion spikes in the room and sent live updates to the Oversight Council. My lesson plans were rewritten. Laughter suppression protocols were implemented. I was to use tone suppression, limited expressivity, emotionally neutral stimuli, So, of course, the cubs laughed even harder. Because kids, no matter the species, can smell a game when adults are trying to hide one. It got out of hand. The vellum cub brought a smuggled laugh fruit into class, a citrus-like orb from his homeworld that induces ticklish sensitivity in sensory pads. He cracked it open mid-lecture. Within seconds, 6 of the cubs were rolling on the floor making wheezy chirps. One Zarnik worm coiled around the ceiling tiles and pulsed bright pink, its species equivalent of hysterical glee. The visor screeched with red alerts. I yanked the laugh fruit away, but the damage was done. I got another citation. The cub got isolation for 72 hours. The others were forced into recalibration modules, sensory tanks that dulled their neural patterns to baseline conformity. That's when I started getting mad. They weren't hurting anyone. They were just happy, curious, alive. And maybe that was the real threat. Because the more they laughed, the less afraid they seemed. Of the adults. Of the rules. Of the system that told them what to feel. I was told to step back from teaching and reassign to curriculum compliance auditing. That's bureaucratic for. Sit in a windowless pod and file reports on why you failed. But the cubs didn't forget me. One by one, they started showing up outside my pod window after classes. Some stared silently. Some tapped their tiny claws or wiggled their antennae. Others brought crude drawings, stick figures of me sneezing, surrounded by squiggly laughter lines. I pressed my hand to the glass. They mirrored it. That night, I watched one of the security feeds. Late after lights out, the vellum cub stood in the hallway with the Zarnik worm and a Fizari pollen pup. They had scrounged together a hollow projector from scrap and were playing back clips from our earlier lessons, specifically, the one where I accidentally slipped on a puzzle block and fell backward into a foam wall. It was grainy, flickering footage. But even through the distortion, their laughter was clear. Uncontrolled. Beautiful. And that's when I knew I couldn't stop. I wasn't just teaching anymore. I was protecting something fragile. Something dangerous. Not to the cubs, but to the order that ruled them. The next day, I requested a return to teaching duties. I was denied. So I submitted a formal objection through Article 7 of the Educator's Code, a clause so obscure no one had touched it in decades. It required a tribunal hearing. It forced them to listen. The Oversight Council scheduled it for the following rotation. I knew I wouldn't win. But I'd speak. For them. And they'd be watching. From that moment, the stakes weren't about compliance anymore. They were about whether 32 cubs from 32 different species would grow up knowing that joy didn't have to be hidden. That laughter wasn't a weakness. That it could be a bridge, between biology, between borders, between fear and freedom. I didn't need to be their teacher to show them that. But the elders would do everything they could to make sure I never spoke again. And this time, they weren't laughing. The tribunal chamber was engineered for silence. Not quiet, silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes your own heartbeat sound like a thunderclap. The floor gleamed with a liquid sheen alloy that muffled footfalls. The walls were lined with absorption panels tuned to vaporize echoes. Even the elder's voice, when it finally came through, sounded like a whisper in a vacuum. "Educator Quinn," murmured Elder Nrizk from the upper dais. "You are present under protest of disciplinary reassignment. State your case." Briefly. 32 cubs weren't allowed in the room. But I knew they were watching. Someone had rigged a small uplink into the vents, a signal pulse pattern unique to the Vellum Accord's calm toys. A kid had cracked the surveillance mesh. They were out there. I stood straighter. "Members of the council," I began, my voice the only ripple in the sterile air. "You've accused me of unauthorized emotional transmission. Of initiating disorder. Of encouraging deviation." No one corrected me. But I didn't teach laughter as rebellion. I didn't weaponize joy. I sneezed. I reacted. The cubs responded. They connected with me, and more importantly, with each other. That is not contamination. That is connection. Behind the glass dais, Elder Shust, a spherical being from the fog moons of Tyrix, let out a slow, pulsing groan. Connection breeds unpredictability. Unpredictability breeds instability. Instability, Educator Quinn, breeds war. With respect, so does repression. That got a murmur. A few elders shifted in their upright tanks. One of them, Elder Vorin, whose crystalline spine glimmered in the ambient light, clicked his mandibles once, disapproval. You are out of line, Rizk buzzed. No. I'm exactly in line. Line 142 of the Education Integration Mandate. All instructors are empowered to nurture empathic harmonics when necessary to facilitate interspecies understanding. I held up the charter tablet. I believe this qualifies. You believe incorrectly, said Rizk, but there was hesitation in his tone. A tremor. I wasn't supposed to quote their rules back at them. But I had done my homework. 3 nights in a supply closet with a filtration vent and a rusted old translator drone that stuttered every few syllables. The tribunal recessed without verdict. Which was their way of saying, this isn't over, but it might not be under control anymore, either. Later that cycle, I returned to my quarters, an oxygen-calibrated dome tucked beneath the administration's spire. Waiting outside was the last being I expected. Instructor Bale. He was a Gurani Iceborn, tall, pale, 6 fingers on each hand, with bioluminescent eyes that dimmed when he was annoyed. And he was always annoyed. The first time we met, he had told me that human emotional instability would set the program back centuries. Now he was in my doorway. I watched the tribunal, he said, not blinking. You spoke with recklessness. Thanks, I said. But precision, too. That startled me. He glanced around, then stepped inside without invitation. The young ones, some of them are refusing recalibration. They request your voice in the immersion chamber. They will not stabilize until they hear you speak. My chest tightened. They're refusing? He nodded once. Even under threat of memory loop. It is unprecedented. Bale, I said slowly. Are you saying they've developed resistance to neuroprogramming? I am saying, he replied, that your influence may not be reversible. I should have been afraid. I should have felt like I'd broken something sacred. But instead I felt something else. Hope. I don't want to undo it, I whispered. I know, he said. That's why they've assigned a new corrective team. Arriving tomorrow. My stomach dropped. A purge? He looked away. Purge. The quiet word for resynchronization protocol, memory suppression, behavioral flattening, neural dampening. In children. I stood frozen. Then I said what I'd never dared to say aloud. I'm going to stop it. His pupils contracted. How? I don't know yet. But I have until tomorrow. He didn't nod. Didn't agree. But before he left, he dropped something on my table. An old calibration keycard. Level 7 access. Without a word, he walked out. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours cross-referencing protocol loopholes, override commands, access tunnels. My hands shook. I drank 3 cups of synth cough and chewed on protein tabs like they were nails. At 0400 hours, I activated the keycard. It worked. I bypassed the educational compound's AI restriction nodes, slid through the service ducts, and emerged in the deep core, an ancient, mostly unused section of the moon that housed old sensory chambers from the integration program's earliest years. And I wasn't alone. The cubs were already there. Every single one. How they got past security, I don't know. Maybe the Vellum cub cracked a backdoor. Maybe Bale helped. Maybe they just wanted it badly enough that the universe bent for them. I stared at the 32 strange, beautiful, dangerous little creatures, all sitting in a circle like story time was about to begin. You know what they'll do, I told them. If you don't let them wipe this away, they'll say you're sick. Broken. Dangerous. The Zarnik worm blinked slowly, then curled into the universal shape of a cent. I looked around. You want to fight back? Chittering. Vibrations. Chirps. A pulse from the pollen pup that sounded suspiciously like a giggle. All right then, I whispered. Let's make the galaxy laugh. We spent hours recording. Not just laughter, stories, games, jokes, expressions of joy from each of their cultures, even the ones they'd been told to forget. The ice-born cub from Neris hummed a tune that made my skin tingle. The triplet spores from the Kelka Flats did a mimicry dance that ended with all three collapsing into each other in shrieking delight. I told stories, too. Old Earth ones. Silly ones. Ones about dogs and pancakes and slipping on banana peels. I even did impressions. They loved the dinosaur voice. We uploaded everything to a hidden relay, a secure back-channel node once used for interspecies translation beta tests. It had been decommissioned. Not deleted. The Vellum cub nodded. We broadcast to the network. I looked at him. All of it? He nodded again. Within 30 minutes, the first ping came through. Not from Xyraxis 4. From Polaris Junction, a core world. Then another from Ganymede. Then another. And another. The cubs weren't just watching anymore. Neither was I. The laughter was spreading. Across Starlinks, between sectors, into feeds and forums and educational uplinks no one had touched in years. Translations autoloaded. Reaction threads bloomed. One message looped across multiple systems. I didn't know my species could laugh like that. It was working. Until the floor trembled. An alarm blared. Not from my wrist pad, but from the dome itself. Emergency lockdown. The elders knew. The broadcast had triggered an automatic containment protocol. The old sector doors slammed shut. The cubs looked at me, not in fear, but in readiness. You can't be here, I whispered. They'll neutralize you. I can stay. But you. The pollen pup emitted a sonic burst so loud I dropped to my knees. Then the Zarnik worm wrapped its segment around my arm. The Vellum cub pressed a code into the side panel. One of the walls flickered and vanished. A projection. Behind it, an old transport tunnel. Decommissioned. Forgotten. They had known. Planned. This wasn't my rescue. It was theirs. Go, I said. They didn't. One by one, they crowded around me. Their bodies warm. Soft. Buzzing. I didn't cry. Not until the Fizari cub reached up and traced a line down my cheek. Then I grabbed my bag. And we ran. We reached the end of the tunnel just as the override drones arrived. The cubs moved with startling speed, coordinated by some silent rhythm I didn't understand. They knew when to duck. When to freeze. When to bolt. By the time we reached the civilian evacuation port, alarms were screaming across half the moon. Bayo was waiting. He didn't speak. Just opened the door to the old cargo shuttle. Powered up the launch sequence. As we boarded, he handed me a data crystal. What is it? I asked. The second broadcast, he said. The one they won't be able to trace. I clutched it tight. Where do we go? Asked the Zarnik worm, using the rudimentary voice box I'd cobbled together. I looked up at the stars. Somewhere that needs to laugh. The launch engines fired. We rose into the sky, 32 cubs and 1 human. A threat to galactic order. And for the first time in cycles I felt free. But I also knew they weren't going to let this go. They would come for us. And next time, they wouldn't just try to silence the laughter. They'd try to erase it. The first planet that rejected us did so with a smile. A calm, diplomatic, tight-lipped smile, the kind that said, "We understand your position. We admire your bravery. Please leave before you infect our children with hope." We weren't surprised. After our broadcast, systems across the outer ring lit up with debate. Some called it a cultural renaissance. Others called it an emotional contagion. The elders called it what it was, an uprising. In the months that followed our escape from Xyraxis 4, we stayed on the move. I taught from cargo bays and mining tunnels. The cubs adapted faster than I could keep up, learning new languages, new customs, new jokes. Laughter wasn't just spreading, it was evolving. But it wasn't safe. Every few rotations, we'd get a ping on the old relay, a tracer pulse meant to triangulate our location. The Elders had deployed trace teams, elite units designed to recover emotionally compromised younglings and re-educate them. They called it restoration. We called it the silencing. So we ran. Again. And again. From moons with golden seas to hollowed-out asteroids where even sound refused to echo. We slipped through embargo zones, disguised the shuttle's transponder, and faked transmission IDs. The Cubs grew clever, disciplined, but never quiet. And then came Nara Prime. We never intended to land there. The shuttle had taken a hit, some sort of viral spike embedded in a pirate signal we tapped into. Fried our guidance system and blacked out navigation. Emergency protocol dumped us onto the surface of Nara Prime, deep in the Technarch sector. It was a dead zone. Or so we thought. The moment we touched down, an atmosphere scan triggered a warning. Ancient civilization markers detected. Active structures present. We had landed on top of a secret archive dome. The Technarchs had left behind vaults, echoes of a species that had once ruled half the stars, then vanished without warning. No one knew if they ascended, fled, or simply laughed themselves into extinction. We descended into the dome with the Cubs stacked close. The interior was layered with glowing script, data hieroglyphs that blinked when the Cubs giggled near them. The dome was alive. And it was listening. "Feel that?" I whispered. The Vellum Cub nodded. Resonance. It wasn't just metaphor. The laughter we'd spread, the emotional frequencies, were triggering dormant code. The Technarch archives were opening for us. Then, in the heart of the dome, we found it. The archive core. A massive construct, part machine, part memory. It flickered with 1,000 voices from 1,000 civilizations. Holographic echoes, cultural pulses, forgotten lullabies and ancient humor patterns from species long gone. And at its center, a locked capsule. On contact, the pollen pup emitted a low whine. "It's sleeping," I said. "Waiting." We tried to access it. My handprint failed. The Cubs tried their own signals, chirps, glows, harmonic pings. Nothing. Until the Zarnik worm pulsed a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. Laughter. Raw. Unfiltered. Joyful. The capsule opened. Inside was a crystalline object, like a heart, but fractal, pulsing in a way that felt not alive, but awake. A voice followed, embedded in every mind in the room. "Laughter is legacy. You are the inheritors." The dome shook. The message had been dormant for centuries. And we had just activated it. Outside, a trace team dropped from orbit. They had found us. We scrambled for cover. The Cubs followed the old tunnels deeper into the dome. I stayed behind long enough to seal the chamber, locking the archive behind a firefield gate. But the trace team had other plans. They didn't storm in with weapons. No shock troops. No drones. They sent a negotiator. A human. Her name was Captain Alex Morrow. Former Earth ambassador to the Galactic Concord. Calm, sharp, unreadable. She walked through the gate like it was hers. I stepped out of the shadows. "You're not here for peace." "No," she said. "I'm here to offer a trade." I didn't speak. "The children come with us," she said. "We return them to the Council. No erasure. No memory wipe. They'll be studied. Preserved. Like relics," I said. "Like anomalies," she corrected. "But they'll live. You get to walk away. You've created enough chaos already." I laughed, cold and bitter. "Is that what they call it now? Chaos? Joy? Laughter? They're not viruses. They're children." She didn't flinch. "The archive you opened, it transmitted. Systems are lighting up across the core worlds. Do you understand what you've done?" "Yes," I said. "I gave them something they weren't allowed to have." Her tone dropped. "And now you've forced the elders to respond. You've destabilized cultures that have depended on emotional discipline for millennia." I took a step forward. Maybe they shouldn't have buried their feelings under centuries of rules. This isn't about feelings, she snapped. It's about control. You've made them remember something they worked very hard to forget. And what's that? That before order there was chaos. And in that chaos, they almost destroyed themselves. Her voice cracked, just slightly. And I saw it. The truth. Captain Morrow hadn't come just to negotiate. She had come because something in her remembered. You used to laugh, I said. She stiffened. I pressed. Before they trained you. Before you became the good little liaison. You knew what it felt like. For a moment, just a moment, she looked down. They wiped that part of me clean, she whispered. No, I said. You buried it. But it's still there. A pause. Then her communicator beeped. 2 hours, she said. Then orbital reinforcements arrive. After that, we take them, with or without you. She turned and walked away. 2 hours. That's all we had. I ran to the archive core. The cubs were waiting, silent now, sensing the shift. The crystal was humming, brighter, hotter. The vellum cub touched it. A new pulse rippled out. Defend the seed. Spread the signal. It wasn't just a message. It was a plan. The archive had more than memories. It had backup protocols. Defense layers hidden in sound. Emotional resonance as a shield. And laughter, as a weapon. The cubs didn't need armor. They needed frequency alignment. I uploaded the final protocol from the crystal. Their bodies shimmered. The Zarnik worm began to hum. The pollen pup vibrated at a low resonance. The Fizari chirped a chaotic trill that echoed off the dome walls. Each cub released a sound signature tied to their species, play signals, affection pulses, mimic loops. Individually harmless. Together? It triggered something ancient. The dome lit up like a star. Above us, orbit shook. The incoming ships were met with a sonic feedback field, not violent, not aggressive, but overwhelming. Laughter, amplified across frequencies. Crew members aboard the approaching vessels began to feel it, memories flooding back, suppressed emotions shaking loose. Some collapsed. Some wept. Some just laughed. The attack stopped. The blockade held. But the damage was done. The Council couldn't hide it anymore. The cubs weren't anomalies. They were the key. The archive hadn't chosen them by accident. It had waited. For a species who could wield joy not as indulgence, but as understanding. It had waited for beings brave enough to disrupt an empire with a giggle. Captain Morrow returned, this time without an army. She stood at the edge of the dome. And for the first time since I met her, she smiled. I want to remember, she said. The cubs surrounded her, humming softly. And the Technarch crystal pulsed again. Begin. The rebirth had started. But not everyone was ready. The elders would come again. Not with words. Not with warnings. But with fear. And we would be waiting. Not with guns. Not with ships. But with something far more dangerous. A punchline. They didn't send warships first. They sent silence. A wall of it. A total calms blackout across the Technarch system, enforced by what the elders called a containment shroud, an ancient array of signal nullifiers and atmosphere suppressors. The kind used only when planets were declared emotionally unstable. The message was clear: no broadcasts. No transmissions. No sound. They thought silence would suffocate us. But we had already learned something they hadn't. Laughter doesn't need permission. It doesn't need sound. It spreads through glances, through breath, through the flicker of memory. It lives even in the stillness. And that's how we prepared to fight. The archive core had begun evolving. The Technarch crystal, now called the heart by the cubs, had restructured parts of the dome. Rooms reshaped into resonance chambers. Echo tunnels formed on their own. The dome responded not just to input, but to feeling. And it amplified whatever we gave it. The cubs trained daily now, not like soldiers, but like empaths. Every species had its own rhythm, its own pulse. Where others trained for battle formations, we rehearsed harmony. Where others studied weapon trajectories, we practiced mimic games and sonic cadence. They weren't children anymore. They were becoming something the galaxy had never seen before. An army of joy. Captain Moreau stayed. At first as an observer. Then as something more. She began teaching too, guiding the cubs through human stories from a past she thought she'd forgotten. Her laugh returned slowly, awkwardly. The Zarnik worm mimicked it perfectly. And the others erupted. Then one night, the sky changed. No sound. No blaring alarms. Just 30 dark specks descending through the shroud like drops of shadow. Council envoys. Unmanned drones designed to deliver messages, and sometimes, ultimatums. They hovered just beyond the dome's range, projecting a synchronized field. A single voice pulsed through every mind, in perfect calm. The anomaly must be neutralized. You have one cycle. I stood in the chamber center, cubs around me, their eyes glowing faintly from resonance practice. They didn't tremble. They didn't hide. The Vellum cub turned to me. One cycle. Then what? Then, I said, they'll try to end it. But they don't know how to end laughter, whispered the pollen pup, curling around my wrist. No, I said, but they'll try to erase it at the source. Us. The heart pulsed once. It understood. The dome began to hum. That night, I sat alone in the outer chamber, watching the envoys drift in the atmosphere. I knew what the council was thinking. Not war. Not diplomacy. A sterilization. A memory scrub of the entire planetary grid. It would turn Nara Prime into another mute monument. So I sent one final signal, not to the galaxy, not through the channels they could jam, but directly into the archive's sublayer. A quantum-laced packet that traveled through emotion-encoded encryption. A joke. The oldest joke I knew. One line. One punchline. Why did the human cross the galaxy? And at the end, I encoded the answer. To teach joy to the ones who forgot how to fall down laughing. It wasn't just a transmission. It was a trigger. The heart ignited. Not in violence, but in amplification. It mirrored the emotional memory of every cub who had ever laughed since we escaped Sire Axis 4. Every vibration. Every trill. Every mimic. And it sent it all, every single emotion, into the dormant nodes of the Technarch lattice beneath Naro Prime. Buried deep beneath the soil were resonance pylons, long sealed. They weren't weapons. They were amplifiers, tuned to respond only to emotional truth. They lit up like stars. And then they sang. Not in words. In resonance. The same way a baby laughs before it speaks. The same way creatures know joy before they're taught what rules to follow. The pylons broadcasted across space. Through the containment shroud. Through the Council's frequency jammers. Through the silence itself. It was unstoppable. Unjammable. Untranslatable. Because it wasn't language. It was laughter. Galaxies away, in systems we'd never seen, being stopped what they were doing and felt something. A warmth. A tingle. A memory of being unafraid. The elders scrambled to shut it down. But the signal wasn't coming from the surface anymore. It was coming from the people. Civilians across core worlds began to hum. Giggle. Chuckle. Laugh. Old jokes surfaced in public archives. Entire species reported emotional anomalies they couldn't explain. Sentients who hadn't expressed joy in centuries fell to their knees, shaking with uncontainable laughter. The elders called it the contagion bloom. We called it victory. But we knew what came next. They couldn't stop the bloom. So they tried to cut the root. A fleet of sterilizers was launched from the inner ring, silent, efficient, merciless. Nara Prime had one day. One. We didn't prepare defenses. We prepared a performance. At dawn, the cubs assembled in the grand echo chamber. Every amplifier, every harmony node, every reflection panel was tuned. They didn't wear armor. They wore paint, markings from their homeworlds. Smears of color, dust, pollen, and crystalline flakes. And every one of them had a voice. They took positions. I stood in the center, heart pounding. And the show began. The oldest cub told a story from his people's mythology, a tale of a foolish bird who mistook the moon for an egg. The way he told it, with swooping arms and exaggerated squeaks, had everyone wheezing. The Zarnik worm did mimicry of the council's speech patterns, exaggerated to absurdity. The pollen pup released humor spores timed to puffs of air that made the others sneeze, which caused more laughter, which caused more spores. It was chaos. Beautiful chaos. The heart pulsed, and the pylons joined in, echoing their joy into orbit. And that's when the fleet arrived. 30 sterilizers. Bristling with signal nullifiers, atmospheric scramblers, quantum dampeners. But when they passed through the upper atmosphere, the laughter hit them. Not data. Feeling. Pilots choked. Technicians dropped to their knees. Some curled up and sobbed. Because they remembered something, themselves. The council issued a stand down. But it was too late. The sterilizers powered down. The commanders asked for asylum. That's how it began. Not with a battle, but with a surrender to joy. Weeks later, the elders released a statement. They did not apologize. They did not admit defeat. But they did issue a new classification. Joy is not a contagion. It is a cultural right. Authorized in educational zones under monitored conditions. It wasn't much. But it was a start. The council remained. But their grip? It cracked. The cubs, now citizens, were offered places across the stars. Ambassadors of emotion. Carriers of resonance. I watched them leave one by one, each planting a seed of the archive in a new world. Captain Morrow stayed behind. She opened the first school of laughter on Nara Prime. Not as an instructor. As a student. And me? I stayed too. Not to fight. But to build. I became the first archivist of emotion. Because history doesn't just live in wars and treaties. It lives in the giggle of a pollen pup curled in your lap. In the mimic of a worm as it hums your laugh. In the final message I sent back to Earth. Mission complete. We didn't just teach them to laugh. They taught the galaxy it was okay to feel again. And somewhere, beyond stars and silence, in the quiet corners of the universe, someone chuckled. Then laughed. And the world turned a little brighter.